The Rebellers by Jane Roberts. A novel. Read by Martin John. Chapter 4. Fitch thought that he was dying, and yet he was aware of being moved, of riding, perhaps in another truck. A cold draught of air hit his ankles. A dank mustiness rose up. He heard the word undertakers distinctively, and his spine prickled, and yet he still couldn't open his eyes. He dozed off again. When he came to, he was amazed to find himself still alive. Yet they were taking him to the undertakers. He discounted the thought that they would bury living men. And yet, why the undertakers? His mind burst into frenzied activity, but he couldn't move his body. Hands felt his body. He couldn't hear a thing, but the fact that he was aware of the hands upon him told him that his senses were slowly beginning to return. His eyes opened. He was laying on a suspended board, and he'd been bound with rope. There were men lying on either side of him. The room was obviously underground, with walls of heavy stone to which beads of moisture clung. Boards stretched from one end of the room to the other, and the men were laid out on them, with arms touching. There were about 50 men that Fitch could see. His lips felt like wood, but he said weakly, "Where the devil are we?" For a moment no one answered. Whatever drug they had given was wearing off at varying intervals. The man to whom Finch addressed his question looked over feebly. "Undertakers." "But we aren't dead. Certainly they aren't going to bury us alive." "What's that got to do with it?" "Shush." The man closed his eyes quickly and let his head slump back against the board. Fitch heard a door close somewhere. The man to whom he'd been speaking whispered, "Lay your head down." Another, closer door opened. Footsteps came along briskly. Now and then they stopped. They quickened, swept past Finch down to the other end of the room. Another door opened and closed. "We have about 10 minutes, the other man said. Fitch opened his eyes. Around him, the men were coming too. Fitch said, "10 minutes for what?" "I'd rather wake up here than dead," another man said. The man beside Fitch said, "At least we won't be hungry." "But what are they going to do?" Finch said. One man said angrily, "A joker, just what we need." But another voice said, "They put us to sleep for 2 years. This is my second time in." Then back to work you go. It's like what they used to call a paid vacation. When they come with that needle, it's lights out, boy. They aren't going to put me to sleep, someone yelled. He thumped his body up and down. Someone else shouted, "Ah, shut up." Another younger voice said, "Yeah, but you don't always come out of it. I knew someone who didn't." The man beside Fitch laughed. "No such luck. They need able-bodied workers too much to let them die. They just do it to build you up. It's like a good night's sleep. Hell, I let them pick me up. I was too hungry to lift a finger. I just threw myself out in the street and stayed there. It's a lot better than waiting till you're half dead. Then it's sleep forever." The young voice said, "Don't even talk about it." Finch silently tested his bonds. There was very little give to the rope. The man beside him said, "They freeze you. That's it. You don't even age. They shoot this stuff in your veins. You don't feel a thing." The younger voice said suddenly, "My father was in the other truck. The other one. You know what that means, don't you? He wasn't strong enough to work anymore. They won't give him another chance." There was an embarrassed silence. Someone said, "Never mind, kid. He's better off. It's better than going into death dance, kinder." But he was in the other truck. He was in the other truck. The young voice kept on. Steadily, Fitch kept straining at his bonds. The man next to him said, "It won't work. You can't get untied." Finch started to answer. The door at the end of the room opened. The men lifted their heads up as far as they could, watching. The undertaker came in with an attendant. He smiled reassuringly. "Now this won't hurt," he said. "There's nothing to worry about. A rest from the world's activities." As he spoke, he bent down over the first man and expertly struck an hypodermic needle into his arm. The attendant ripped back the molding material of the sleeve and swabbed the circle of flesh with disinfectant. The man groaned, tried to wiggle out of reach, sighed, and lay still. Goosebumps broke out on Fitch's skin. He was the 10th man down. The operation took only a moment or so. As the undertaker gave the injections, he kept up the nervous professional chatter. "You're to be envied, really. Think of the others out there, still working day after day, night after night, always hungry. You'll be healthy and refreshed when you awaken." "My father was in the other truck," the young voice yelled. "Unfortunate, unfortunate," the undertaker said, "but there isn't enough room or food for those too sick to work. It's all a matter of preservation. At least he didn't starve to death. At the same time, he made a motion to his attendant. They broke off the orderly succession of the injections and walked past Finch down the line to the young man. The boy was yelling. His voice rose in a crescendo of fear and panic. "You'll be all right," the undertaker said smoothly. The attendant swabbed the trembling arm. The injection took over. The voice quieted. Then the two men went back where they'd left off. They stood 3 men away from Fitch. He tried to move his legs, to see if he could possibly kick hard enough to protect himself when his turn came. But he couldn't rise his knees far enough. The other men were silent now. Again, Fitch experienced the sense of shock, that conditions in the outside world could be so bad, and that he hadn't known. All he could do was watch, fatalistically, as the undertaker came closer with his inane chatter and his needle. The man beside Finch said, "Well, here goes. I'm next. Sweet dreams." Still Fitch couldn't believe it. His neck hurt from holding his head up so long. He was stiff with anger and tension. For the first time he'd noticed that they'd bandaged his leg. The undertaker stood in front of him. "They fixed your leg while you were unconscious. Don't give it a thought. It'll be good as new." The attendant came closer. Fitch braced himself. Suddenly the lights went out. The undertaker and the attendant stepped back. "Electricity's off again," the undertaker said. They walked away hurriedly. Fitch sank back, weak with relief. A door opened in the darkness. A voice said, "Which one of you men is from the gallery?" Fitch yelled out, "Here!" A set of double footsteps ran across the room. 2 men rushed to Fitch's assistance. Hands cut his ropes. He sprang up. "What about the others?" he said. "We can't use them. Hurry, this way." Some of the men booed. A few begged to be freed. Fitch hesitated, but the men who had freed him pushed him along. They turned a flashlight on briefly, so that Finch got an idea of the layout of the room. The 3 of them ran through the door and out into the dark hallway. They froze as footsteps approached. One of the men flashed the light again. The undertaker stood motionless, staring. Fitch flattened out against the wall, but the undertaker said, "Get him out of here." He took a key from his pocket, opened a door in the wall, and stood inside. "You're lucky, young fellow," he said to Fitch. "I couldn't have put it off another minute. You'll never know how close you came to getting that needle." Then he said to the others, "Hurry it up. You took your time, I'll say that. The men motioned Finch to follow. As they went inside, the door locked again. They paused to catch their breath. Fitch said, "Who the devil are you? What's going on?" "No time now." One of the men said, "We lost enough time as it is, but we wanted them to get that leg of yours fixed up first. In the excitement, I forgot about it." With amazement, Fitch realized that his leg was much better. The thought came with a rush of strength. At least he could rely on himself physically again. They began walking down the corridor. This time no one spoke. The air grew colder and damp. They were going deeper and deeper into the earth. The hall took another turn. The men opened another door. Bursts of air rushed up refreshingly, but still everything was dark. "Feel your way along. We can't use light, and be quiet," one of them said. They were now in a long underground tunnel. It was impossible to stand up. Hard-banked earth met Fitch's inquiring hands. The sides rose up steeply. There was only room enough in the path to put one foot before the other, and they went along single file, heads bent, hands touching the banked earth for support. Everything had been still. Without warning, all sorts of sounds clattered overhead with sudden vehemence. The loudspeakers shouted their "Go, go, go! Work, work, work!" Trucks rolled. There were shouts and screams, all alarmingly close after the secrecy and silence of the escape. Fitch realized that the tunnel was beneath the street. He expected the trucks to fall through from the sound they made. It took a good 2 or 3 minutes before the tunnel turned away, and then went deeper. He knew that they must be nearing the Chemung River. Then the pathway widened. Dim light showed through. Fitch and the 2 men scrambled out on a bank of slimy mud. Fitch had trouble seeing after the darkness of the tunnel, but the tumultuous sounds of voices made him suspect that they'd landed from the frying pan into the fire. "Hurry, jump," one of the men said. He did, and fell down onto something hard and wet. His vision cleared. Groups of dirty men and women clustered nearby on the river bank. They dangled all kinds of fishing gear into the water. Some of them were fighting among themselves. The hard surface Fitch found beneath him was the bottom of an old rowing boat. One of his rescuers grabbed the oars and began digging them into the mud to get the boat off. Out of the corner of his eye, Finch saw a third man scurry away, as if he'd just arrived with the boat. At the same time, a woman suddenly noticed them. she shouted out to the others. They stopped fighting, looked up, and came rushing over. The man with the oars lifted them menacingly. From the boat, the other man pulled up a heavy wooden club. The group slowed their approach, but the women shouted, "There's only 3 of them and 6 of us." She was in the lead. Behind her a man said, "Where did that boat come from? It wasn't there a minute ago." "Beat it," said the man with the oars. He stood hip deep in the water now. Finch could feel the boat begin to lift. The woman threw a rock, but it planked down harmlessly in the river. The man with the club yelled to Finch, "Throw the food to them. There's some in the bottom of the boat." Quickly Finch looked down, found a crumbled mess of greenish leaves, and threw the slimy greens by handfuls toward the people. The woman stopped yelling for a moment. Then she shouted, "Dandelions!" and caught them up from the water. She tasted them quickly. The man behind her grabbed them away from her, and Finch threw in the last bunch. The boat cleared the river bottom. They were out a good 20 feet. By the time the people finished fighting over the dandelion greens, the boat was already disappearing down the river. Finch looked back. The man he'd seen sneaking away from the boat had returned. He stood yelling at the group of people and pointing in the other direction. Something about the man's motions caught Finch's eye. He was sure he'd seen him before. In the meantime, the boat sloshed down the river. Now and then it hit bottom. They had to get out and push it along. It was rough going because the water was full of debris. The stench was sickening. Filthy huts rose up on either side of the river. Now Finch could see them clearly. Junk and pieces of board all piled together haphazardly, looking more like rubbish heaps than shelters. The land to the left was fairly level, but the hills began on the right, dotted with numberless dugout caves and crevices, pockmarked with clumps of people and shanties and debris. The tallest of the 2 men was rowing. The other searched the terrain anxiously. Neither of them seemed ready to talk, so Finch took the time to look them over. Besides, he felt his strength returning and decided to rest while he could. Also, he wanted to learn the lay of the land. He was filled with curiosity and some regret. His cell at the gallery attained the glow of a lost Eden as the status of the outside world impressed itself upon him. People were everywhere. The river was crowded with all kinds of homemade crafts. Everyone was fishing, but no one ever seemed to catch a fish. The water was so muddy that it was like a thick, foul-smelling pudding. A few blocks away a sign showed up above the roofs of low huts. Quote, "Fresh cat paws, barter." End quote. People sat along the riverbanks, sticking their scabby legs in. No one seemed to be following them, yet the shorter of the two men kept up his constant vigil, staring intently with long worried looks at the shore as they passed. The other rowed quickly, hitting at the water as if it were an enemy to be beaten to death. The people in the other boats kept bailing out. All of the crafts seemed to have holes. Now and then the man who rowed scooped up water from one side of the boat and threw it out the other side, apparently so that their boat would look as inefficient as all the others. It was late afternoon. Fitch was so used to the silence of the men and the steady motion of the boat that when one of the men spoke quickly and the boat turned toward the shore, he was instantly on guard. "Just follow us," the taller man said. They went in with the boat until it hit bottom, and then just left it there. This part of the bank was comparatively empty of people, although the rubbish heap huts were crowded as closely together as before. They trudged up through the mud. "Watch out for rats," one of the men said. A pile of river dirt and wood was right in front of them, and they made for it. Fitch noticed that they no longer seemed worried about pursuit as they neared the debris. Fitch saw a cleverly designed entrance. They all scurried inside through a clutter of rubbish about 4 feet square, then ducked down and squeezed behind some more boards. It was so dark inside that Fitch kept one hand on the man in front of him for guidance. Then suddenly he felt, rather than saw, a cleared space. The next moment a light glimmered. He was in a small, clean room, and one of the men had lit a candle. A ramshackle table and a few chairs sat in the center of a dirt floor. There were no windows. The walls were composed of mud, but they glowed with an eerie light in the half-darkness. The tall man sat down. The shorter one busied himself in the far corner, with his back turned. A trickling sound bubbled nearby. The man emerged with a basin of water and soap. They all washed in the same water. Then the taller man took out a pill from a small box and gave it to Fitch. "Take it, you'll need it. Your shot will take a day or so to take effect, and this will hold you over." Fitch hesitated. The shorter man said irritably, "You want to get the plague? You will if you don't take the pill." Fitch took it. The men relaxed. The taller one said, "This place never looked so good." Then to Fitch, "Make yourself comfortable. will tell you who we are." The shorter man started grinning. "Here's something first," he said. He went over to the corner and came back with a loaf of hard bread with some dry milk powder that he mixed with water. They ate slowly. With food in his stomach, Fitch was beginning to feel more like himself. The taller man said, "I'm Sloat Braille. This is Gunny Bargan. We had one hell of a time trailing you. Of course you realize that you couldn't have made stupider moves if you tried." "You mean looking for a doctor?" Fitch said. "It seemed reasonable enough at the time." "If you'd stayed with the man and the girl, we could have saved you a lot of trouble," Sloat said. Fitch realized that he liked the man. Sloat was over 6 feet, a giant compared to most, with deep-set eyes and a small face that was almost chinless. His movements were very deliberate. It was he who had been the rower of the boat. The other man, Gunny, Fitch liked less. He had quick, energetic eyes and black hair. There seemed to be an excitement in his face all the while. Nevertheless, he did nothing that Fitch could take exception to. Fitch said, "The girl hit me over the head. For your own good. She thought you were crazy when you insisted upon wanting a doctor," Sloat said. "How do you know?" Sloat just shrugged and smiled. "I keep thinking of that injection. You certainly just got to me in time," Fitch said. "What did you help me for?" "How did you know I was from the gallery to begin with?" he said with a laugh. "A few little things like that I'd like ironed out." But even as he spoke, he realized that he was still on edge. He decided that he'd had enough. He reacted to circumstances, but he hadn't acted. He was through being pushed around. If he didn't like the answers that Sloat gave him, then he'd make a few decisions of his own. But he also knew that his ignorance about the outside world was still appalling. He said, "Suppose you start at the beginning." In Chapter 4. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.